Tears of the Kingdom starts off really strong. It begins in a dank cave with this mysterious music that wells and becomes more ominous the deeper you go, and these bold historical images carved into the walls that make your curiosity peak. It's just as interesting and exciting as the first trailer from 2019, and it made my heart pound in my chest the first time I played it. Then you walk out of this cave and into the light, and it echoes the first moments of many games past, when suddenly, during the initial hours, this game is incredibly in touch with this feeling of grandiose spectacle. It really plays up to the fact that you are playing the sequel to Breath of the Wild, and it's going to be the greatest game ever just because of that fact. The thing is, as those hours go on, it has to live up to being Breath of the Wild 2 outside of those grand showpieces, into the actual moment-to-moment gameplay. And this is where Breath of the Wild 2 starts to become a bit redundant with the context of the original, and sadly, things start to get a little wobbly. Before we begin, I'd just like to say upfront that I think it was hard for Tears of the Kingdom to live up to the hype of being a sequel to Breath of the Wild in the first place. It's the follow-up to the 4th best-selling game on a console that has sold over 140 million units and over 1 billion games. The odds of making something that appeases everyone who plays that is a losing battle, so for even attempting to live up to that level of expectation, I have to give Nintendo a bravo. Now, that being said, you also have to recognize the successes of this game along with where it falters. Sequel or not, I think it was necessary that Nintendo followed up to Breath of the Wild with another open-world Zelda game. Why? Because Breath of the Wild was and still is not a perfect game. It has a dodgy weapon durability system, repetitive boss and dungeon theming, and a narrative that is almost completely disconnected from the gameplay. The plot of the original Breath of the Wild is basically that you screw around until you're strong enough to fight Ganondorf, and the rest is exposition with out-of-place voice acting.
So if this Calamity Ganon does in fact return, what can we really do? We just don't seem to know much.
Trust me, I love Breath of the Wild, but this is a good start for open-world Zelda and not a flawless product. In fact, it really speaks to Breath of the Wild's quality that a game can be this flawed and still be so fantastic. It's also that roughness that makes the idea of a sequel so exciting, because it would be able to deliver on what this game didn't. So naturally, when that sequel did get announced, I got real pumped, because it meant that Nintendo would be able to refine the mechanics and further the consistency. Easily the best addition of Tears of the Kingdom is the new runes. Stasis is gone, Cryonis is gone, Magnesis is gone, and the bombs are gone. Instead we have Fuse, Recall, Ultra Hand, Ascend, and Auto Build. It's not bad that they are gone, because they all have a counterpart in the new gameplay. The new runes are the freshest thing they added to spice up the formula. Rewinding time, fusing together cool weapon combos, and of course, building insane goofy vehicles is Tears of the Kingdom's strongest gameplay. The reason for Breath of the Wild's originality was its deviation from linear game structure. With an emphasis on discovery and player freedom, the tired Zelda formula finally opened up its lungs and took a Breath of the Wild. So naturally, this continuation of allowing for creativity is what makes it so fun to play. Also, a lot of these runes fix problems that were established in Breath of the Wild, like traversal, weapon durability, and same-ish combat. Tears of the Kingdom's best moments come through experimentation with these new runes. You know, just building these absolutely stupid fucking machines for no reason other than to goof off. If you're a creative person who loves to experiment, you will love these new runes. And if you aren't, you will still love the new runes because you can just use the templates that you get in the underground like a dweeb. Speaking of. You know, there was this small little indie game I played way back in February of 2022 called Elden Ring. And I remember there was this really cool moment in that game that stuck with me quite a bit. This game is massive, and I was just beginning to grasp how big this game was, when suddenly I stumbled across an elevator. And it kept going down, and down, and down. And then I realized, there's a whole massive underground inside this already massive game. The great thing about this underground in Elden Ring, though, was that this underground wasn't a gimmick either. It had a variety of themes depending on which area you went into, there was interesting level design, and it gave the player the right balance of linearity and openness. I think if you packed all the actual content in Tears of the Kingdom's underground together, it would probably take up about less than a quarter of the actual space used up here. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but in an already massive game, another dimension of empty space is not what I needed. I don't mean to undermine the actual content in the Underground. There's actually some really cool stuff in here, like the Master Koga questline, the bosses, the Colosseums, but the majority of the stuff here is simply not worth the space at all. I suppose that the devs would want you to use this as a playground for all the different vehicles then, but not only does the overworld already serve that purpose, but there's so many stalagmites and limited vision even with the lights added on your contraptions that getting around here is a complete chore. My complaints with the Underworld would be less warranted if the overworld were more interesting to explore. But unfortunately, Tears of the Kingdom struggles at times to make the old map from Breath of the Wild fun to play in again. All of the major locations have some small changes, like the Zora's Domain gets polluted, Death Mountain has no more lava, but it doesn't make Zora's Domain worth exploring again just because I have to trudge through mud this time around. Although the Gorons are addicted to hard drugs, which is neat, I guess. Fundamentally, I had the most fun with Breath of the Wild because of its exploration. It was a completely brand new idea to have an open world Zelda at the time. In Tears of the Kingdom, the exploration aspect of the game is put at a disadvantage due to a reused map. The novelty of running around Hyrule is gone. Some of these remixed areas are a lot of fun, like the minecart ride up Death Mountain, the fight inside the Great Deku Tree, and of course the floating Hyrule Castle. The Sky Islands are a pretty cool idea too, but in a weird move, they simply just didn't add enough content to the sky. In fact, the largest area in the sky is the tutorial island, so the bulk of my gameplay is once again forced to be spent in the same map as Breath of the Wild. This game has a lot of great ideas, but when they're hopelessly stuck in between stuff I already did in Breath of the Wild, it undermines that creativity. It just comes off as exhausted rather than downright bad, which is still painful. The new dungeons as well feel too reminiscent of the Divine Beasts from 2017. Open-ended dungeons aren't a terrible idea for open-world Zelda, but there has to be a better solution than finding 7 or so terminals found across the area. What I was hoping for was some sort of progression as you unlock areas of the dungeon, like a linear Zelda game would, and the game gets a hint of this in the Lightning Temple as you have to go upwards through the tower, but it isn't all there. What I think could have benefited Tears of the Kingdom is not giving you the champion abilities until you explore further into the dungeons, and then you go and unlock pathways that you couldn't before with your new abilities, Metroidvania style. You could still have the open structure, it's just more focused now. Or fuck it, just even give us the old 3D dungeon style back. I sure wouldn't complain. The themes of the dungeons are fine, and the bosses are passable as well, but if you were to put these dungeons up with the linear games ones, Tears of the Kingdom wouldn't stand a fucking chance. While at times it feels like Tears of the Kingdom struggles with living in the shadow of its predecessor, it's not like remixing past content has worked poorly for Nintendo in games prior. One of the most acclaimed Zelda games, Majora's Mask, quite blatantly reuses assets and mechanics from the game that came before it, Ocarina of Time. The difference between it and Tears of the Kingdom though, and the reason it works better in Majora's Mask, is because of traditional linear structure, and the way its smaller scale sometimes creates for easier development. Was it fair to expect Nintendo to make a completely new map for Tears of the Kingdom? Probably not, but when they made that decision to reuse the map, they had to have known that it would risk being repetitive, and it also doesn't mean that I can be expected to enjoy running through the same map again. Maybe it's not fair to pit Tears of the Kingdom up against Majora's Mask, because both obviously had a lot of effort put into them, but it feels more like a problem of sheer concept rather than the work put into it. Nintendo was justified in their decision to reuse so much from Breath of the Wild, but it kinda screwed them over right from the start. The thing that frustrates me the most about this is that the new abilities are so damn fun, and are so great to experiment with, but exploring this old map pales in comparison to exploring the limits of these new gameplay mechanics. Tears of the Kingdom often plays like it's battling to give you worthwhile stuff to do, and when the game treats the template of Breath of the Wild like it's close to the best they could do, rather than a starting point for completely new ideas, it feels less refined and less creative than what recycling got us 24 years ago. Tears of the Kingdom is the best game I've ever had the pleasure of being bored by, and having let my feelings with it marinate for the past year, it's still hard to capture the almost incompatible emotions I have with this game. It excited me with new ways to explore Hyrule, but simultaneously the content I searched around for in these wacky vehicles didn't prove to be substantial enough. Its questlines rarely get more exciting than fetching materials. The rewards for completing dungeons are companions that aren't around when I need them and stand way too close when I don't need them. And despite being given the opportunity to fill Hyrule with more meaningful content without the burden of map creation, it's padded with busy work and feels more empty than Breath of the Wild, because you're robbed of the excitement of exploring it. Despite that incredibly negative and very long sentence I just uttered, somehow, strangely, it has given me a level of fun that many games wish they could achieve. Tears of the Kingdom is way too similar to an already existing fantastic game, which means to some extent it still is fantastic, just in a more weird and off-putting way. Much like Breath of the Wild was necessary for the series to grow, I think the places where this game falters is important in seeing where the series will change and adapt. It speaks to the quality of Nintendo that despite all my gripes with this game, it still has a lot of parts that are quite enjoyable. And while I know this video is mostly talking about the game's faults, I don't have crazy negative opinions on this game. They just kind of come out when talking about the game's shortcomings, and that's because this game proves to be more fluctuatingly disappointing than just poor. The lows are low, but at certain intervals of gameplay, when the creativity of the new content is expressed nearly perfectly, I absolutely loved playing this game. Despite all the gripes, I still put in almost 200 hours into this game, and it's hard to put that amount of time into a bad game. Much like how it begins with a massively exciting set piece, it ends with probably my favorite final boss in Zelda history, and it's hard to argue with that as well. Tears of the Kingdom's biggest faults come from being too similar to its predecessor, Breath of the Wild. But when Breath of the Wild is such a fantastic, creative, and fun take on the open world genre, then probably its sequel where you can build a shaft and balls isn't the end of the world.